welcome one and all once again to episode 5 of Exile Gaudamus. I am Gaudamus, your forever DM, once again bringing you content about all things Path of Exile 2. In today's episode, we are going to cover my newest build, Beelzebub. Now, I knew going into this build that it would be the weakest build I have created as of yet to date, but to be honest, I really was not prepared for just exactly how difficult this build was going to end up being. In today's episode, we will also be covering a topic that I believe is absent from some players' gaming experience. Playing a weaker build just for the thematic elements and enjoyment of the process, rather than always and only playing the most powerful meta builds available. So without further ado, sit back and relax, smoke yourself a little smoke, and drink yourself a little drink while we delve fully into Beelzebub, the Lord of Flies and Swarms. So to get started on today's topic, I want to first reiterate that I am sorry for the length of time between video releases. Truly, I knew that what I was planning on trying to do would be by far the most difficult build I had attempted to make. And yet, to be honest, I had completely underestimated just how difficult the challenge would actually be. What is it that makes this build so challenging, you might ask? Well, I wanted to create a build with the Staff of the Unborn Lich as my main weapon, and still have it be strong as a minion and chaos build. This in and of itself poses a huge problem with theory crafting. You see, I wanted to run an insect, swarm, and chaos build, and to do that in the most effective way possible, I would have to find myself utilizing a scepter and then a wand, a shield, or a focus to maximize the amount of spirit that I could have, and therefore maximize the number of minions that I could have. Something you might want to know though, if you don't already know it, is that insects are not the strongest monsters in the game by any means of the word. And with the loss of frozen mandibles being a specter or a companion, the viability of insects as a main feature of a build is already lacking to an extremely terrible degree. Then, by using the staff, I'm also at about a loss for half of the amount of spirit that I could get with a good scepter. And then I was also missing the extra levels that you would normally roll on the scepter and then the offhand weapon, as far as the extra minion levels, so to speak. And so while I knew ED Contagion was super strong to begin with, I didn't know if it would be strong enough to make up for the number of minions that I would be missing out on. And on top of that, I was not even able to truly focus on chaos magic, again missing the levels needed to focus on ED and Contagion. This was a hybrid build, Master of Many, and or what is it? You're a Master of Many, or you're good at many and Master of Nothing. That's what it is. The next thing you should know is that the staff that I had selected and paid 10 divs for gave me extra spirit and spirit efficiency to make up for the fact of losing the scepter. But I couldn't even equip the staff until level 84. So this means that the build wouldn't even begin to get off the ground and come online until at least that level. Now that I had my challenge laid out before me, I wanted to begin to work on it despite knowing firsthand how challenging it might be. But even with these limitations, I felt I could see some real potential in the build, and the thought of playing something so off the wall and non-meta had me chomping at the bit, to a point where the thought of it was becoming so pervasive that even while playing my other characters, I was rationalizing and theory crafting in my mind about what would be the best build strat that I could have and utilize to make this build work. Now that we've gone over all of the expected difficulties of the build, I want to address one more thing that, to me, made this build utterly irresistible to do. And that is to address the idea of only playing meta builds or things that are strong to the point of ease. This very conundrum harkens back to the old days of gaming, when the Game Genie first was introduced. For those of you under the age of 35, the Game Genie was a bank, basically, of cheat codes that you could use to modify your gaming experience with a huge variety of cheats for anything and everything that you could ask for to make your gaming experience easier. It had things such as unlimited lives, super god modes, invincibility, etc. And honestly, while it was fun for like the first 2 hours of using it and trying it out, it grew old really, really, really fast, and was shelved by everyone that I knew shortly after they got one, because while it was fun in the first few minutes to be completely unkillable or have infinite retries in whatever game you were playing, it actually removed almost all of the fun from the games themselves, because they were no longer, for the most part, the least bit challenging. They simply lost the dopamine receptors of, or lost the dopamine rush, I should say, that you would get from conquering them, for beating them. Now, some games had fewer codes than others, and they weren't affected as badly as the ones with huge amounts of codes, but for the most part, the Game Genie wore through the novelty of its existence faster, I believe, than anyone at the time would have thought possible. Now, why am I discussing this, you might ask? And the reason for that is actually simple. There are builds in this game that, by their very nature, are so stupidly powerful that they remove most of the skill of actually playing the game. In this instance, I am referring to such builds as COC, Comet, and Spark, and other builds along those lines, which are fairly easy to theory craft out, and yet so stupidly powerful that they remove the skill element and enjoyment from the game. The simple reason I am bringing this up is that I fully believe that there are a ton of players out there in PoE 2 that choose to only play this type of build. After all, they think that builds like this are the only way to truly have fun in the game. But I would like to state here flatly and plainly, and in as simple English as I can, that I disagree, and that you can absolutely have fun by putting yourself at a flat inherent disadvantage simply because of playing something that you want to play, and that the extra challenge will make your victory much, much sweeter and more fulfilling when you do eventually fight your way through the challenge and succeed, even if it takes way more time and energy than you initially thought it would. The payout alone is enough to set those dopamine receptors in your brain to fire off at record-breaking speed. So now that I've said all of that, let's get started with the build itself and why it has taken me so long to be able to put a video out about it. A lot of this I will honestly gloss over so that I can go fully into the topics that are the most important in the pretext of the video. In Act 1, everything went super smoothly, with ED Contagion doing most of the work, and even then, the Act 1 boss, Count GNR, would prove to be little issue since I had gear that more than compensated for my lack of strength of build, and truly, the only thing of note about the whole thing was that skeletons and skeletal snipers were actually better than I anticipated them to be, especially when given the proper support. So while I wish I had more exciting things to report about Act 1, it was actually pretty bland in all honesty. So now we are ready to move on to Act 2. And in Act 2, I had my first actual major hiccup. I had planned on making this a Monk of Chaiula build because of the thematics of it, but unfortunately for me, there was a huge flaw in my plan on how the monk would work out. You see, I figured out at this point in time that there were certain summons in the game that didn't count towards your spirit at all, because they were part of the item that gave it to you. Here's looking at you, Hissig's Claw. I thought that this meant that there were other summons in the game that would be also free to summon, so to speak, because this was present in the game already. Having said this, you have to understand that that would mean I could have minions while simultaneously taking the Monk of Chaiula's Darkness skill node. However, upon further review and research, I realized that my core founding principles for what I was trying to do with the build were flawed in an inherent way. The Staff of the Unborn Lich doesn't give you free undead companions as the talisman did for hyenas. Instead, it gave you the companion that functioned just like any other companion in the game by design, other than the fact that it gave you an undead companion, in contrast to the normal skill Tame Beast, which requires beast-type monsters to work. This posed a huge problem for the build as I was envisioning it, and so with great regret and trepidation, I re-rolled to a new character that I figured could use the Lich Ascendancy for unholy might to try and get my swarm's inspectors to become stronger passively, so that in the end the build could become more viable. So I stopped what I was doing and immediately started over to begin my reroll process, and once again, Act 1 was no problem with ED Contagion doing most of the work, and this time I was also utilizing Unearth to give me another swarm of insect-like creatures. Now, let's discuss Unearth. This is a skill that allows you to attack an area with spiked bones in a cone shape, and any corpse that was caught in the area, or if a monster dies as a result of the impact of the attack, then scorpion skeleton creatures would be spawned or summoned, and then would remain till they died, or until their duration was up. By themselves, these little guys are not too dangerous, but as you get stronger, you get more and more skeleton scorpions on every casting. And on top of that, if you use it on the corpse of enemies that had been affected by contagion, the skill would raise scorpion skeleton minions that were chaos imbued. When built like this, those little scorpions could actually cause some pretty insane damage, and thanks to them, I got through Act 1 and into Act 2 with very little difficulty. In fact, I think it only took me a day to get caught back up to where my Chayula monk was in progress. So into Act 2 I went, and I'm not sure if I had mentioned this before, but the Ascension trial is so much easier with a ranged spellcaster over a melee character. So if you're new to the game, I would personally recommend using a ranged character for your first time through to save yourself the major hassle of dealing with too much of the honor system. It should be noted, for the most part, until I got through Act 4, that I was using a scepter and a shield, a wand or focus, just whatever was strongest at the time, just to remain strong enough to complete the content, while sticking to my goals of switching once I was in the end game and everything was working out accordingly. At the end of Act 2, everything seemed hunky-dory, to be perfectly honest with you, though I was a little on the weaker side and things were a little bit harder. We moved into Act 3, and the first thing that should be mentioned is that even with fully stocked number of minions from both Unearth and what I could summon from my scepter, the giant fucking monkey didn't care. This was the very reason I made sure to be utilizing both my Unearth skeletons and summons alongside the usage of ED Contagion. You see, the AI of summons isn't smart enough to tell them to get the fuck out of the way of the monkey's biggest attacks. So even if you were full of summons, it wouldn't really matter because they would attack en masse, head on, and then be killed en masse by one swing of that fucking monkey's pillar. This fight actually made me think about Muhammad Ali, if I'm being honest. You see a ton of people, including Muhammad Ali himself and George Foreman, state that fighting Muhammad Ali wasn't really fair because he fought backwards. In fact, George Foreman once said, Ali could jab going backwards or to the sides, and that shot would always find you. He would catch me with a jab as I was coming forward, and it was so difficult to counter that punch. This quote from Foreman perfectly illustrated the fighting style that I realized this character would specialize in. If the opponent was coming forward, and there was nothing you could do to stop it, then you should get the fuck out of the way. Whether that is to the side or by backtracking, it doesn't matter. What is important is that you should always leave the opponent with a consequence of moving forward. For Muhammad Ali, that meant a jab. And for Beelzebub, that meant using ED Contagion to keep harming the opponents, even while fighting backwards, as it were. While it may seem counterintuitive to fight backwards, sometimes, as Muhammad Ali proved, it is the best option. And just like Ali did, I utilized this tactic to push through the trials and to make my ascensions clear and scot-free. So this strategy worked then, and then continued to work through the remainder of Act 3, but I could tell for a while that it was not going to be sustainable. At least sustainable given any normal expenditure on items and on defenses. And don't forget bad luck, because with my luck, I have to rely on the items in the trade market and defenses. By the end of Act 3 and the beginning of Act 4, I had realized that while fighting in reverse would be my best option, it was becoming increasingly more and more difficult to pull off as the strength of my enemies increased. However, having said this, the fight for my second Ascension trial went through without any sort of egress or inconsistency. I breezed through Act 3, and I made it to Act 4 with almost no issue. However, due to the limitations on the character that I myself had implemented, I began to struggle to make it through the content because I was lacking in damage from both minions and from spells, as I could not do both at the same time with this type of strategy. And it was in Act 4 I found myself doing well on the way to the boss, and then sometimes doing well with the boss, and at other times I was failing miserably. My issue, you see, was unearthed. Sometimes I would make it to the boss with a completely maxed out set of scorpion skeletons, and that would just crush the boss, no problem. But then, at other times, I was walking into the boss fight with only my ravenous swarm and the swarm insects I had made into my specters, and when this would happen, I would notice the absolute difference between having the scorpion skeletons versus not having them. Though, I will admit that fighting backwards would give me an inherent advantage due to my attacks dealing damage over time. This allowed me to cast a spell at range and then run away, and despite it seeming to be cowardly, it was truly effective, all the while carrying me further and further into the endgame, even if that endgame seemed like something unachievable while adhering to the limitations that I had set for myself. Now then, once again, or I should say, once I had actually gotten to the meat of the endgame, let me tell you that this is when the real trouble began. I was able to get through maps of up to tier 7 with no real worries. But once I tried to break through juiced tier 7 maps, I really began to feel the hurt of the weakness of the build that I was attempting to create. I could do enough damage over time to kill the enemies, at least decently quickly. But if I got swarmed hard, which of course happened fairly often in maps, I would get blown up, and I mean blown up hard. I will admit that during this time, I could have saved up and bought some better gear, but that at this point in our story, I think it is time to discuss a long overdue topic at hand. The price of a build in divs to facilitate said build into being considered as viable. You see, here is something that isn't really discussed all that much in the community, at least by everything I have found. And I guess it's honestly because most of the players out there are simply looking for the quickest, easiest paths through the game. I gotta say that this is not a problem. For many people, that it's just simply human nature. To choose the path of least resistance or to play only the types of builds that will carry them forward and to beat the content with no real strategy or work towards their end goal is fairly common amongst gamers, actually. Though that surprises me to this day, it just completely blows my mind. And I gotta say, while I have no issue with those types of players, I must admit that this is not the type of playstyle that I would ever be found enjoying myself. Now at this time, let me take a moment to address the elephant in the room, as it were. And I would like to express this sentiment now after describing this experience up to this point. The game economy. Now, I have to admit I'm not an economics expert, nor do I fully understand the more nuanced aspects of a given economy and how it relates to me in whatever fashion is going on at the time. I can tell you that from personal experience that I don't give credence to all of the doom and gloom naysayers about the economy of this league. Yes, to start with, this league was given negative press due to the temple. And yes, this league was given negative reviews even after the initial phase of the temple, because once it was found out how amazingly rewarding the temple could be, the next set of information that came out was how long it would take to build the temple properly, unless you utilized the controversial Holton mechanic, which has since been removed. However, after a few weeks and the start of the private Second Wind League, these topics had mostly died down due to the economy seemingly stabilizing itself. I don't know why this sense of FOMO is so strong in this game, but it is. And unfortunately, a huge aspect of this game for players is this FOMO syndrome. They want to compare their experience with those of people who can spend 100 hours a week grinding away and have the time to study and analyze all of the league mechanics before anyone else really gets the chance to do so, simply by nature of the amount of time that they're able to play. However, comparing yourself to one of these types of people is truly a flawed concept, and in my opinion, it's a flawed way inherently to approach the game. You see, you might have all the time in the world, but not be skilled and you can't accomplish something. Or, at the same time, you might have all the skill in the world and have very little time, so once again, you can't accomplish this, whatever task you're trying to. Both of these things are possible, and both of them are inherently flawed due to the reasons that they breed dissatisfaction amongst the player base. In my experience and opinion, especially coming from a forever DM, the beauty of this game is that you can decide when and how you want to play. And if something you pick isn't necessarily the strongest option, that's okay. I see things on YouTube all the time talking about how a certain build only costs this many divines to get off the ground. And yet I feel the need to tell you, this is an obsequious formula for success at best. You see, a lot of builds need no help from items or luck, as that's just how strong they are naturally. And yet other builds might need 50 divines, or 100 divines, or even a mirror worth to truly show how they function. So I ask you, which build is better? The one with the cheap cost to pull off, or the one with the expensive cost? And I hate to tell you, but the answer to this question is neither. The better build is the build you want to play and you enjoy playing, not which one is mathematically more efficient. Now, are there builds that function more easily than others? Yes, there are. And are there builds that don't come into their own till late in the game? Of course there are. Yet the thing that matters most is simply how much fun you are having in the present moment. You see, the overall best aspect of this game is that you don't have to play what is meta to have success. The only thing you need to have success is your own level of enjoyment. Whether that means you can slaughter the Arbiter of Ash on the first attempt with one button press or not, the answer is still the same. What build is better? The answer would shock a surprising number of people, since the answer is simply, which build is the most fun for you to play? This actually reminds me of an instance that happened to me many years ago, and I feel strikes hardcore correlations to the topic at hand. One day, I had a buddy ask me who I thought was the braver person. The soldiers who went and fought on the landing of Normandy Beach in World War II? Or the journalists who went along as well with no intention to fight and wish only to share the news of what they witnessed during the time of the war with the world at large? I'd love to know what you guys think, but I feel the need to tell you the answer that I gave. When asked who is the braver group of people, my answer came swiftly and instinctively. The answer to who is the braver group of people at that point in history to me is very simple. And that is, the braver person is the person who is the most afraid when they landed. You see, bravery in this instance was not about what the person did after they landed, but conquering the fear that they experienced in lieu of the fight yet to come. This is the same principle and practice of this game, though I will say that it is a limited analogy that I simply struggled to find a better way to express. I'm not necessarily trying to say that gamers playing a game in any way, shape, form, or fashion are equivalent to soldiers going off to battle. Instead, I'm trying, albeit with some difficulty, to highlight the FOMO that grips a large part of the player base, and am trying to show how that fear can lead to gamers playing something that they may not normally play, they might not normally enjoy, and they may not necessarily want to use, but they do so anyway, simply because they think they're going to miss out if they don't. So, having discussed players' fears and anxieties, let's proceed once again with Beelzebub. Heading into the endgame, I honestly was filled with hope at how much I was enjoying the character. However, based on my own skill and own limitations that I had placed on the build, I progressed far slower than I would have liked. However, I made my way through the game with very little actual setbacks until level 83. And this is the point in time where we really need to examine the concept of why I was making this build and why I was continuing despite the fact that I was struggling so much. You see, while I had the foundations of a build covered, and I had already bought my weapon for the build through the trade website, one thing that still remained and was vexing to say the least was the cost to make it viable. I'm used to making builds that can beat the endgame and the Arbiter of Ash and all that stuff with only minimal expenditure, something along the lines of 15 to 20 divs per build. Yeah, I must admit that getting to level 84 and thus being able to equip my chosen weapon was an issue that I had seriously underestimated because of the journey between level 83 and 84. In fact, that one level was the hardest thing for me to do that I've experienced in this game to date. I spent over a week at level 83 trying to grind and force my way to 84, even though my damage was middling and at best my survivability was nearly non-existent considering the level of difficulty I was playing on. Yet all the while trying to force my way through with limited expenditure of any sort of gear that would actually help me. It was finally at this point, a few days ago, that I realized a different viewpoint. I literally, finally, realized that some builds were simply going to take far more currency to get off the ground than others. To the point of me literally having to shelve Beelzebub for the last few days just to grind up more currency to make it work. Even though every other character I'd ever made to date needed at most 15 or 20 div budget to defeat the highest levels of difficulty in the game to offer, this build I slowly realized would take far, far more. So, I spent the last few days backtracking on other characters that were stronger inherently and just grinding in general on a greater difficulty with my Oracle Wolf and my Legion so that I had said currency to get the necessary gear. Now let me ask you something. After all of this work, was the build less functional than other builds? No. Was the build more expensive than others? Yes. Could they be equally as fun? Yes. But the second build option was far more detailed and needed help way more than the first. Now, would I say that it was the wrong choice in my opinion to play the newest build? Absolutely not. However, would I recommend it as my first option for a person to play as a build for this game? 1000% no. In conclusion, there are so many builds out there that are new builds. They're literally being discovered every day. And that is one of the greatest beauties of this game. Good builds or bad, strong or weak, all builds out there can most likely be made to be viable, despite there being several that require many more resources to start to feel good. So take from this what you will, but I can say that after a week solid, and now I've spent about 50 divs on Beelzebub, that you can get into the late stages of the endgame, despite what the community says is true or that can happen. I mean, recently, there was even a content creator who beat the game with no items whatsoever. And in a video before that, they beat the game without using the passive tree. This game makes every option contained within it viable. It's just up to us as players to figure out the methods to achieve it. By the way, currently, Beelzebub can finish juice maps of up to tier 12 at my current level of 85, now that I have a good staff equipped. But by the end of the season, I plan on making this character strong enough to beat T16s and the Arbiter just to prove to myself that it can be done. So, I'd like to take this time to once again say thank you, one and all, for joining me for today's latest episode discussing the endgame. late game character viability, and resource management. All the while getting to showcase my Beelzebub build that I am actually quite proud of. Will my build remain the same by the next time you guys see it? Probably not. But will it get stronger? Absolutely. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining me on my continued adventures through Rayclast. And I want to wish you well in your own gaming, theory crafting, and character development. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed today's content. And if you have any questions or thoughts at all, please feel free to leave a comment down below, as I really would enjoy any theory crafting advice or just a general discourse involving the game. Thank you one and all for joining me today, and look forward to my next episode, which could cover another new character in the build out for them, or it might be a revisit to a character that I've already done, but would take a build all the way through the end game in the Arbiter of Ash and that kind of thing. So, once again, I appreciate it, guys, and thank you all kindly from the bottom of my heart. This is Godimus from Exile Godimus, wishing you much luck and joy through your own adventures in Rayclast. Have a good one, guys. Bye-bye.